Imagine a city gripped by a terror so profound that residents were afraid to breathe within the safety of their own homes. The year is 1962, and the location is Boston, Massachusetts. A sprawling metropolis known for its history and culture was about to become the hunting ground for a phantom. This was not a horror movie, but a cold reality where single women found themselves locking doors that had never been locked before. The fear was palpable in the air, hanging over the cobblestone streets like a thick fog. A predator was loose, and he seemed to be able to enter apartments without force, leaving behind a trail of silence and death that would haunt the city for decades. The nightmare began on a warm evening in June, when a woman named Anna Slessers was found dead in her apartment on Gainsborough Street. She was a 55-year-old seamstress who lived a quiet and respectable life. There was no sign of forced entry, which suggested she might have known her killer, or perhaps he had talked his way inside with a charming smile. The scene inside was chaotic yet oddly staged. The most chilling detail was the method of murder. She had been strangled with the cord of her own bathrobe tied in a peculiar bow under her chin. This gruesome signature would soon become the terrifying calling card of a madman. Panic began to simmer, but it had not yet boiled over until the bodies continued to appear with alarming frequency. Weeks later, two more elderly women were found murdered in similar circumstances. Nina Nichols and Helen Blake were both strangled in their homes with nylon stockings or household items knotted in that same distinctive way. The police were baffled by the lack of physical evidence and the absence of any signs of struggle at the entry points. It appeared as though the victims had welcomed death into their parlors. The press began to connect the dots, and soon the moniker that would freeze the blood of every Bostonian was coined the Boston Strangler. The profile of the victims initially suggested a hatred for older women, leading police to suspect a matricidal maniac. However, the pattern shifted terrifyingly in December of 1962. Sophie Clark, a 20-year-old African-American student, was found strangled in her apartment. This shattered the established profile. The killer was not just targeting the elderly, but was an opportunist who struck whenever a vulnerable woman was alone. The death of Sophie Clark sent a shockwave through the younger population of Boston. No one was safe regardless of age or race. The city was dealing with a monster who seemed to evolve and change his appetites on a whim. As 1963 arrived, the body count continued to rise relentlessly. Patricia Bissett was found dead in her apartment shortly after the new year. The police were overwhelmed by thousands of tips and leads that went nowhere. Every eccentric neighbor and delivery man became a suspect in the eyes of the terrified public. Hardware stores sold out of locks and door chains as women barricaded themselves inside. The atmosphere in Boston was electric with paranoia. The police department was under immense pressure to solve the case, but the killer left no fingerprints and no witnesses. He was a ghost who walked through walls. The investigation was hampered by the lack of modern forensic technology that we take for granted today. There was no DNA testing, and computer databases were non-existent. Detectives had to rely on old-fashioned shoe leather and intuition. The Boston Police Department, along with state authorities, formed a special task force to hunt down the strangler. They interviewed thousands of known sex offenders and deviants. They combed through mental health records and followed up on every suspicious person report. Despite the massive manpower deployed, the killer remained elusive, striking again and again with impunity. In an act of desperation, the authorities brought in a famous psychic named Peter Herkos to assist with the investigation. This move showed just how helpless the police felt in the face of this enigma. Herkos arrived with great fanfare and made several bold predictions describing a man with a physical deformity. His visions led the police to harass innocent men and wasted valuable time while the real killer continued to roam free. The reliance on a psychic was a public relations disaster and only served to heighten the anxiety of a populace that felt their protectors were grasping at straws. The murders were not just simple killings, they were performative and ritualistic. The killer often left the bodies in shocking positions, sometimes posed to degrade the victim even in death. This psychological warfare suggested a deep-seated misogyny and a need for control. The strangulation knots were tied with a surgeon-like precision, or perhaps a sailor-like familiarity. Detectives pored over knot-tying manuals and interviewed dock workers, hoping to find a link to the maritime industry. Every clue seemed to lead to a dead end, leaving investigators frustrated and the public terrified. By early 1964, the official victim count had reached 13. The final victim attributed to the Strangler was Mary Sullivan, a 19-year-old woman who had moved to Boston from Cape Cod just days before her death. Her murder was particularly brutal, and the scene was horrific. The killer seemed to be escalating in violence. After Mary Sullivan, the killings suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was almost as frightening as the murders themselves. Had the killer moved on to another city, or had he been arrested for another crime and was sitting in a jail cell unbeknownst to the task force? Enter Albert DeSalvo, a man with a history of breaking and entering and sexual assault. He was known to the police as the Measuring Man because he would trick his way into women's apartments by claiming to be from a modeling agency and needing to take their measurements. Later, he became known as the Green Man for the color of the work clothes he wore during his crimes. DeSalvo was arrested in late 1964, not for the murders, but for a series of rapes. He was sent to Bridgewater State Hospital for the criminally insane. It was there that the story took a dramatic turn. While incarcerated at Bridgewater, DeSalvo struck up a friendship with another inmate named George Nassar. Nassar was a highly intelligent but dangerous man serving time for murder. DeSalvo reportedly began to boast to Nassar about his exploits, claiming to be the Boston Strangler. Nassar, realizing the potential for a reward or a deal, contacted his lawyer. The authorities were skeptical at first. DeSalvo did not fit the profile of the sophisticated killer they had imagined. He was a blue-collar worker with a history of non-lethal crimes. However, they could not ignore the confession of a man claiming responsibility for the most infamous crime spree in Boston history. The Assistant Attorney General John Bottomley was tasked with interviewing DeSalvo. These interviews were intense and lengthy. DeSalvo provided details about the crime scenes that supposedly only the killer could have known. He described the layout of the apartments, the clothing of the victims, and the specific way the ligatures were tied. He spoke of the urge that would overtake him, a pressure that built up until he had to kill. To Bottomley and many others, these details were the smoking gun. It seemed the monster had finally been unmasked. However, there were significant problems with the confession of Albert DeSalvo. He got many details wrong. He misidentified the time of day. Some murders occurred and described physical evidence that did not exist. Skeptics argued that DeSalvo was a compulsive liar who sought fame and attention. They suggested he had gathered information from police photos he might have seen, or from coaching by other inmates like George Nassar. The idea was that DeSalvo was taking the fall for crimes he did not commit, perhaps in exchange for money for his family, or simply to be somebody in the eyes of the world. Despite the confession, Albert DeSalvo was never tried for the murders of the Boston Strangler victims. The lack of physical evidence linking him to the crimes made a prosecution risky. Instead, his lawyer F. Lee Bailey negotiated a plea bargain where DeSalvo pleaded guilty to the sexual assaults and other crimes he was originally charged with. He was sentenced to life in prison. The authorities considered the Strangler case closed, but the public and many legal experts remained unconvinced. The resolution felt hollow and rushed, leaving a cloud of doubt over the city. The theory that the Boston Strangler was not one man, but several began to gain traction. The victims varied greatly in age and race, and the modus operandi was not always consistent. Some investigators believed that the murders were the work of 2 or even 3 different killers operating independently. DeSalvo might have been responsible for some, but certainly not all. This multiple killer theory suggested that the police had lumped unrelated homicides together under one convenient label, creating a myth of a single super predator where none existed. Albert DeSalvo's life in prison came to a violent end in 1973. He was found stabbed to death in the infirmary of Walpole State Prison. His killer was never prosecuted due to the code of silence among inmates. Before his death, DeSalvo had recanted his confession, claiming he had made it up. This final twist only deepened the mystery. Did he recant because he was innocent, or was it a final game played by a psychopath? His death meant that he could never be questioned again, and the truth seemed to be buried with him in his grave. Decades passed, and the case of the Boston Strangler remained a subject of debate and speculation. Books were written and movies were made, but the central question lingered: one man or several? The families of the victims were left without definitive closure. In the early 2000s, renewed interest in the case led to calls for modern forensic analysis. Evidence that had been preserved for 40 years was retrieved from storage. The hope was that DNA technology, which had revolutionized criminal justice, could finally provide the answer that had eluded detectives in the 1960s. In 2013, a major breakthrough occurred. Investigators obtained a water bottle discarded by a nephew of Albert DeSalvo. They used the DNA from the bottle to compare it with seminal fluid found at the scene of the last victim, Mary Sullivan. The results were a match. This was the first piece of physical evidence linking DeSalvo to any of the Strangler murders. Authorities exhumed the body of DeSalvo to confirm the findings with a direct DNA sample. The test confirmed with 99.9% certainty that the DNA belonged to Albert DeSalvo. The DNA evidence proved that Albert DeSalvo murdered Mary Sullivan. For the authorities, this was vindication. They declared that DeSalvo was indeed the Boston Strangler and that the case was solved. However, this scientific proof only covered the final victim. What about the other 12 women? There was no DNA evidence remaining for the other cases. Skeptics pointed out that proving DeSalvo killed Sullivan did not automatically prove he killed the others, especially considering the differences in the earlier crimes. The mystery was partially solved, but the full picture remained fragmented. The legacy of the Boston Strangler case is a complex tapestry of fear, police procedure, and legal maneuvering. It highlighted the dangers of tunnel vision in investigations and the risks of relying on coerced or attention-seeking confessions. The case also changed the way women viewed their own safety in urban environments. The era of leaving doors unlocked was gone, forever replaced by a vigilance that persists to this day. The shadow of the Strangler loomed long over Boston, a reminder of a time when the city held its breath in collective terror. Looking back at the timeline, the evolution of the crimes tells a story of escalation. The initial murders of elderly women suggest a killer with a specific pathology, perhaps driven by a hatred of a mother figure. The shift to younger victims suggests a change in the killer's confidence, or perhaps the entry of a second killer into the fray. If DeSalvo was the sole killer, his psychology was incredibly complex and adaptable. If there were multiple killers, then several murderers escaped justice, hiding in the shadow of the one man who took the blame. The role of the media in the Boston Strangler case cannot be overstated. The sensational headlines and the constant coverage fueled the panic and put immense pressure on the police. The moniker itself, the Boston Strangler, helped to create a mythic figure. This media frenzy might have influenced DeSalvo, a man known to crave attention, to insert himself into the narrative. It serves as a cautionary tale about how media narratives can shape public perception and potentially derail criminal investigations by encouraging copycats or false confessors. The involvement of F. Lee Bailey, the attorney who represented DeSalvo, added another layer of theatricality to the proceedings. Bailey used the case to build his own reputation as a high-profile defense lawyer. The legal strategy of using the confession to secure a place in a mental institution rather than the electric chair was a high-stakes gamble. It worked in keeping DeSalvo alive, but it also prevented a trial where the evidence could have been scrutinized by a jury. The legal maneuvers obscured the truth in favor of a plea deal. Today, the streets of Boston are different. The apartments where the victims lived have been renovated, and new tenants live there unaware of the horror that once took place within those walls. Gainsborough Street and Charles Street are bustling with life. Yet for those who remember the early 60s, the geography of the city is marked by invisible monuments to the victims. Anna Slessors, Mary Mullen, Nina Nichols, Helen Blake, Ida Urga, Alice McQuiston, Beverly Simmons, Evelyn Corbin, Joanne Graff, Patricia Bissett, Mary Brown, Sophie Clark, Mary Sullivan. Their names must not be forgotten. The question remains open for many criminologists and historians. Was Albert DeSalvo the sole perpetrator, or was he a convenient scapegoat for a series of unconnected crimes? The DNA evidence in the Sullivan case is compelling, but it is a single data point in a sea of ambiguity. It is entirely possible that DeSalvo was a killer who committed the final murder, but that other men were responsible for the earlier deaths. The concept of a copycat or a coincidental cluster of killings is not impossible in a large city. One must also consider the psychological profile of Albert DeSalvo. He was a sexual predator with a distinct pattern in his assaults as the Green Man. The leap from non-lethal sexual assault to serial murder is significant, though not unheard of. However, the dramatic shift in victimology from elderly women to young students remains the biggest stumbling block for the single killer theory. Serial killers typically have a preferred type, and sticking to it is part of their ritual. The Boston Strangler defied this rule, leading to the persistent doubt. The Boston Strangler case also exposed the limitations of the mental health care system and the prison system of the time. DeSalvo was a known offender who was released back into society despite warning signs. His time in Bridgewater and his eventual murder in Walpole highlight the brutal reality of the institutions charged with housing the criminally insane. The failure to contain a man like DeSalvo before he could escalate to murder, if indeed he did, is a systemic failure that had tragic consequences for 13 women. As we analyze the cold case files, we see the desperate attempts of the police to find a pattern where there might have been chaos. The Strangler Bureau was drowning in information without the tools to process it. This case was a catalyst for the modernization of police work. It underscored the need for centralized databases, better interagency communication, and advanced forensic science. In a way, the failures of the Strangler investigation paved the way for the more sophisticated methods used to catch serial killers in the decades that followed. The story of the Boston Strangler is more than just a whodunit. It is a social history of the 1960s. It reflects the gender dynamics of the time, where women were expected to be polite and submissive, even to strangers at their door. It reflects the racial tensions of the era seen in the different public reactions to white and black victims. It reflects the trust people placed in authority and how that trust was eroded by the inability of the state to protect its citizens. The Strangler was a mirror held up to society, revealing its vulnerabilities. Ultimately, the mystery of the Boston Strangler, one man or several, may never be fully resolved to everyone's satisfaction. The DNA closed the book on Mary Sullivan, but the other chapters remain written in pencil rather than ink. We are left with a probable solution, but not a definitive one. The ghosts of 1962 still whisper in the alleyways of Boston. They remind us that evil can wear a charming smile, and that sometimes the truth is buried too deep for us to ever fully uncover it.